Hello. Benjamin Franklin was born in 1706 in the town of Boston, Massachusetts. But what was Boston like at the beginning of the 18th century, and how did it shape Franklin to become the founder we know him as today? These are some of the questions we'll be exploring in this very first episode of the podcast Finding a Founder, a mini-series that explores the life of Benjamin Franklin, his role in the American Revolution, and his legacy in the cities of Boston, Philadelphia, and London. I'm your host, Henry Wilkinson, and every episode I'm going to be talking to leading figures from institutions across the US and UK to discuss Benjamin Franklin's life from birth to revolution, looking at different themes such as education, religion, innovation, science, and diplomacy in the 18th century. Today I'm joined by Lou Rocco, who is Director of Museum Operations and Experience at the Old State House in Boston, Massachusetts. Lou, hello.
Hi, Henry. It's nice to be with you.
So, without further ado, Lou, can you kick off this podcast by setting the scene and telling us what was Boston like at the beginning of the 18th century?
Yeah. So Boston at the time was a small peninsula called Shawmut by the indigenous people who also lived in and used it prior to English settlement. It was about a square mile large, about a fist-shaped peninsula that was attached to the mainland just by a very thin strip of land known as Boston Neck. And so most people arrived in Boston via water. Many of the wharves that Boston had built, dozens of them by the time Franklin was born, were the main entry and egress into and out of Boston at the time. So the water, the ocean, the sea, Boston Harbor, was incredibly important, would have been important to a young Franklin, exploring his town, exploring the wharves, speaking to the many maritime laborers and craftsmen that undoubtedly were present in town at the time. There was a real relationship and connection between Boston and the sea.
How many people lived in Boston in the 18th century, at the beginning of the 18th century?
Yeah, so estimates vary, but it's roughly between 8 to 10,000, which easily makes Boston the largest British colonial town. The next nearest towns in terms of population and influence are New York and Philadelphia. And by the time Franklin leaves Boston in 1723, they're only hovering at about 6,000 people in New York and under 5,000 in Philadelphia. So Boston is demographically king in that regard. There's more people, there's more commerce, there's more going on in Boston than anywhere else in the British North American world.
Benjamin Franklin was born on Milk Street, pretty central Boston, probably about a stone's thrown away from the harbor or a short walk from Boston Harbor. I wonder, Lou, if you could describe what it would have been like for a young Benjamin Franklin to walk through the streets of early 18th century Boston.
Absolutely. As you said, the Milk Street home was probably just about 5 or 10 minutes from the harbor, from the coast. And that's because most of Boston's residents lived on the eastern half of the peninsula, close to the coastline. The town itself was divided into a south end and a north end, residentially speaking. And in the middle of that was the townhouse, now the Old State House. And so Boston, or I should say Franklin, walking from his home in the south end, which is where Milk Street was, would have crossed by residential homes and dozens of different types of artisans. In fact, in his autobiography at one point, once his father Josiah realizes that being a candle maker and a tallow chandler probably isn't for his son, he tours him around Boston to observe many of the different types of artisans and crafts that Boston had to offer at the beginning of the 18th century. And there were at least 36 different types of trades and crafts being practiced in Boston at this time, generally grouped into woodworkers, metalworkers, and smiths, folks who worked with apparel, both making apparel and fixing it. Those who worked in food, bakers and vintners were present. And by far and away, probably the largest industry was the maritime, and you had folks building ships, making rope, making sails. All of this would have been visible throughout the eastern side of colonial Boston that Franklin would have walked through from his South End home through the center of town, where the townhouse and Long Wharf, the largest wharf in Boston, would have been found, into the north end of town.
Is it safe to say, therefore, that Boston is sort of the center of the colonies, the British colonies in North America at that time?
Yeah, I think it's safe to say, and I'm not just saying that as a as a proud Bostonian and somebody who's lived in Massachusetts my whole life, although that might be part of it. But yes, it is the economic center. It is the literary center. Boston has a number of printers and newspapers, booksellers, uh, unlike anything else seen in British North America at the time. So it's a cultural center. It's an economic center. It's a powerhouse, certainly in the region of New England specifically as well.
So you mentioned newspapers and printing there. Benjamin Franklin, one of his first roles would be as a printer. But before we talk about that, how would information make its way throughout the colonies? What sort of systems were in place to allow information to travel between various regions in that area?
And here we see the central importance of the coast and Boston's position on the Atlantic coast again, because a lot of foreign news would be coming into Boston through its numerous wharves and ports. Those ships wouldn't just be carrying goods and people, but also information that would then spread through the town via word of mouth. The first newspaper in colonial America, as far as I know, was started in Boston in 1690. It only lasted one issue because it was censured by the colonial government. But still, you have the first newspaper that starts to spread that news as well beyond word of mouth. And as the 18th century progresses, you have, by the time James Franklin arrives, Benjamin's brother, and establishes the New England Current, there are already two other newspapers in Boston, the Boston Newsletter and the Boston Gazette. And so word of mouth is still important, but eventually you start getting printed sources of news that are also helping to disseminate information and ideas throughout Boston, Massachusetts, and New England.
You mentioned James Franklin there. Benjamin Franklin, one of his first roles out of school, and we're going to be talking actually to the Boston Latin School in a future episode to tell us about Franklin's schooling. But when he leaves, he becomes a tallow chandler with his father, but decides that that's not the job for him and decides to move into the print business as an apprentice under his older brother, James. I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us about the New England Current and Franklin's relationship with his older brother.
Sure, yes, and it's completely understandable why Benjamin didn't find his father's adopted trade. He was a silk dyer in England, but took up tallow chandlery afterward. It was a grimy and grubby and unpleasant and smelly trade. So credit to Josiah for supporting his very large family with that, but understandable why a precocious young Benjamin wouldn't want to engage in that throughout his life. So yes, James returns to Boston from England, from London, I believe, in 1718. He establishes the New England Current in 1721. He is printing actually one of the other newspapers in town for a while before the printer or the publisher decides to go with a cheaper printer. But James in London was taking in the work of papers like the Spectator and the Tatler, and he didn't see anything like that in colonial Boston, an independent, lively, entertaining, unofficial journal and newspaper, one that wasn't sanctioned by or printed by the government or an official in Boston, which the other papers were. They were published by the postmaster. And it's unlike anything that colonial America had ever seen in that regard. And it wasn't afraid, unlike some of the other newspapers in Boston, it wasn't afraid to question, criticize officials, both in the state and in the church, ministers, magistrates, postmasters, Harvard College, really the constellation of institutions in New England Puritanism were fair game as far as the Current was concerned. And so it made the paper unlike anything else, and it made it much more entertaining, much more lively, and humorous. There was a considerable degree of satire and humor throughout the pages and issues of the Current throughout its run, which Franklin contributed to himself with his Silence Dogood essays. But it also, of course, made James some enemies in the colonial government and in the church as well.
So it sounds like James set up quite a popular newspaper, and Franklin helped the success, as you mentioned, with the Silence Dogood letters. For those who perhaps are unfamiliar with Silence Dogood, I don't suppose you could sort of introduce us to this character that Benjamin Franklin adopts in order to get himself published in his brother's paper.
Yeah, so Benjamin is apprenticed to his brother beginning in 1719, and so he is in and around the print house all the time. Printers worked, as many artisans did, very long days, 12 to 14 hours a day, nearly, or sometimes 6 days a week, save the Sabbaths, save Sundays. And so he was there a lot, and he was in an environment where not just James, but many of his contributors, who fancied themselves wits, perhaps in the form of the Tatler and the Spectator, were talking to each other. And he was, imbibing this conversation, the ideas, the wit of these men. And so he decides to create a persona, a female persona named Silence Dogood, who was the widow of a minister in Massachusetts. The name itself is interesting because it is partially a satire and critique of one of Boston's more famous ministers, Cotton Mather, who was known for never being silent, but also for publishing a book of ethics called Bonifacius in 1711, the subtitle of which was Essays on Doing Good. And so part of it was a sort of a subtle jab at Cotton Mather and his sense of himself. But part of it was also, I think, a genuine expression of Franklin's altruism and civic spirit, which he uses Silence Dogood to articulate through the essays. But Franklin is concerned, because he's the younger brother of James, that if he were to submit essays in his own name, that James would not publish them. So he ends up creating this persona to get around that and submit the essays more or less anonymously. And they are immediately impressive to James and his contributors. And they publish 14 of them throughout the course of 1722.
I mean, what would these essays have been about? Why were they so popular and appealing to the newspaper audience?
So some of the topics that Franklin covers through Dogood in 1722 include satirizing Harvard College and college education more generally, calling out religious hypocrisy, proposing projects to do good, civic projects, altruistic projects, one of them being a sincere project for the relief of poor widows, and the other one being a more satirical project for the relief of spinsters or older virgins. So he was not afraid to delve into to sometimes riskier topics as well. He also covered topics like drunkenness, Boston's nightlife, and others. And so what is impressive, I think, to James and his contributors is the style of these essays. They certainly don't seem like they're written by I think Franklin at that point is 16 years old, and he's penning essays that even to modern readers seem like they'd be written by a man in his maybe mid-20s, a man who's lived and read considerably. And so the style is evocative, again, of the satire and wit of the Spectator and Tatler, but also some of the other current writers who contributed essays to the journal too.
You say he was adopting a persona and impressed everybody at the print house. Was he ever found out as the source of the Silence Dogood letters?
Yes, by his own hand. Eventually, he reveals to James and the contributors at the Current that he is indeed the author of the Silence Dogood essays, which many of the contributors find quite amazing and astounding. James, however, had a slightly different reaction. He was a little disappointed in his brother and warned his brother against vanity and allowing the praise that he was receiving from some of the other contributors to go to his head. James and Benjamin had sometimes a contentious relationship. Franklin writes in his autobiography that at times James's temper would get the best of him and he would sometimes beat his younger brother. So while he received praise from a lot of the contributors of the Current, James sort of rained on his parade a little bit. I don't think James was fabricating a concern when warning Benjamin about his vanity. There was a time around the publication, actually it was before and after the publication of the Silence Dogood essays, where Franklin actually has to assume responsibility as printer and publisher of the Current because James gets in trouble with the colonial government. So in that time period where Franklin is temporarily publisher, he probably thinks to himself, yes, I can I can do this on my own, or I'm certainly capable of running this paper on my own without my brother. And he even tries to shop his skill set and his talents elsewhere in Boston after he leaves the Current, but finds that his brother, James, had gone to the other printers in town and essentially blackballed his brother Franklin from being hired by other printers because he was still technically, secretly apprenticed to James, unbeknownst to the colonial government. So Franklin is sort of caught between a rock and a hard place at this point. He either goes back to his brother, again, who he has a difficult relationship with, and he can't find work elsewhere in Boston with any of the other printers, which in part compels him to leave in 1723.
And we'll hear all about where he ends up in a few episodes' time when we talk to some of the Philadelphia-based institutions taking part in this series. But speaking of institutions, Lou, you work at the Old State House, arguably one of the more iconic buildings, one of the most recognizable buildings in Boston. But for those who haven't been or perhaps don't know much about it, can you briefly summarize what is the Old State House?
Yes. So the Old State House, the building that I currently work in, was constructed in 1713, and it served as the colonial capital building for Massachusetts Bay Colony. Massachusetts had a wooden townhouse prior to the brick townhouse that Franklin would have been familiar with. That was built in the 1650s, but unfortunately burned down in a large fire in 1711. So Franklin would have been familiar with both the original wooden townhouse and then the replacement brick townhouse that still stands today.
What exactly was the function of the Old State House? What did it do during this time?
Yes, so both the wooden and brick townhouses that Franklin would have been familiar with were effectively the seat of colonial government. So this is where you would have found the governor, the governor's council, the House of Representatives, and even parts of the colonial judiciary meeting and working on the second floor of the building. The first floor of the building would have been a more utilitarian meeting space. And once the brick building, the current State House, is constructed in 1713, it is used by a variety of different groups, including merchants. When they would go on their merchant walks throughout Boston, would sometimes use the first floor of the Old State House to meet. And it also served as the local municipal town meeting for Boston until they construct a separate building called Faneuil Hall later in the century.
And you mentioned it would be where you could find the governor. Is this the royal governor? Was this somebody elected as an official to oversee the colony, or was it a locally elected individual?
So by Franklin's birth, the governor is royally appointed. That is one of the consequences of the revocation of Massachusetts' original charter and establishment of its new royal charter in 1691. So the governor previously was popularly elected, but now is appointed by the crown. But yes, he would have been here in the Old State House on the second floor, meeting with his council on matters related to the colony.
And Benjamin Franklin, is there a connection to the Old State House? It sounds as though this is where a lot of things happened. Would Benjamin Franklin have ever visited the Old State House, or perhaps actually gone in and taken part in what was happening inside?
So undoubtedly he walked by it numerous times. He would certainly have been familiar with both the wooden townhouse and then the replacement brick townhouse. To our knowledge, he did enter the Old State House once, at least, in his time in Boston, and not for the reason that perhaps a teenager would want to be called into a government chamber. So in 1722, James Franklin, Benjamin's brother, who printed the New England Courant, published some news about some pirate activity going on, not in Massachusetts, but actually a little further to the south in Rhode Island. And he commented upon how the Massachusetts government, situated in the Old State House, was working on their own response and gathering resources to respond and help with the hunting down of these pirates. But he adds at the very end this very innocuous, sort of facetious, teasing line about the government perhaps delaying their response based on weather and other things. If you read it, it certainly doesn't seem like James is going particularly hard at the colonial government, especially relative to some of the other things that the Courant printed. But for some reason, this really rankled the governor's council. And so the next day after that edition is printed on June 12th, 1722, both James and Benjamin are called into the governor's council chamber. I should point out that the Governor's Council was the most elite and powerful governing body in the Massachusetts Bay colony government. This was an elite group of very powerful men who you did not want to cross. And so on that day of June 12th, 1722, James and Benjamin are interrogated by the Governor's Council. James is actually placed in jail for 3 weeks because of his impropriety, as far as the council saw it. Benjamin was also interrogated, and according to his own account, didn't really give the council much to go on. Perhaps it was maybe a moment of thrill and adventure to kind of thumb his nose at the most powerful body in the colony by giving them no information on his brother. Maybe he thought he was protecting his brother, trying to protect his brother by keeping his secrets. But effectively, he is slapped on the wrist. He's admonished by the council and sent away to then, because his brother James is in jail, to assume publishing and printing duties of the Current for 3 weeks.
And arguably set him on the path to become a printer himself later in life. And obviously, Benjamin Franklin, eventually he leaves Boston, he moves to Philadelphia, he moves to London. Did the Old State House ever hear from Benjamin Franklin again when he was out of Boston? Was there any communication or correspondence that...
Yes, so Franklin does return to Boston at least a couple of times, I believe, in his lifetime after he leaves more permanently. And he does engage with officials in Boston throughout that time. He's certainly in correspondence with men like Samuel Adams and those leading the radical and patriot faction here in Boston later on in his life and as the American Revolution approaches. But it's never, to my understanding, it's never a prolonged or deep or influential correspondence. He probably misses his home to an extent, but he isn't super engaged or following the news and things going on in Boston as closely.
You mentioned the American Revolution there, which is obviously a big part of what this podcast is also covering. Benjamin Franklin's role in the revolution and how the revolution affected the areas that he once lived in, like Boston, for example. Was there anything that happened at the Old State House that is closely tied to the American Revolution?
Oh, absolutely. So being the seat of British royal authority in Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Old State House was the site of many protests and debates as questions of taxation, representation, autonomy, self-government crept up in the 1760s and 1770s. One of the first instances of these actually happens in the Governor's Council chamber in 1761, where a young lawyer named James Otis Jr., who was previously a solicitor actually for the government, chooses to leave that position and defend merchants against writs of assistance, which were effectively carte blanche search and seizure warrants that allowed customs officials to search the homes, warehouses, and property of merchants on suspicion of smuggling, which I should point out Boston was well known for. But in that chamber in 1761, Otis delivers a famous 5-hour-long speech against the writs, but also more generally about the rights of colonists as Englishmen and women, and how the writs violated those, and that taxation without representation was something bordering on tyranny. Later, John Adams, the second president of the United States, who was in the room when Otis delivered that address, wrote that, quote, "Then and there the child independence was born." So that happens directly in the Old State House. But there are many protests that pass by it or around it that involve a number of the tax laws that Parliament passes in the 1760s, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. All of these are met with increasingly virulent and sometimes violent responses by the people of Boston that the Old State House would certainly have been aware of.
I wonder if you could tell us about the most famous example of one of these protests ending in quite a bit of bloodshed.
Yes, the Boston Massacre is the most famous Revolutionary era event connected to the Old State House. So, as I mentioned, there were violent, loud, raucous protests against many of the tax laws that Parliament was passing and that royal governors were trying to enforce. Eventually, things get so hairy in Boston for customs officials, for tax collectors, that the royal governor requests assistance from the British military because Boston had become largely ungovernable by the late 1760s. And the British military is happy to oblige. And General Thomas Gage brings around 3,000 soldiers to Boston in October of 1768. To put that number in perspective, Boston at this time has a population of around 15,000 people. So you're talking about one soldier acting more or less as a police officer for every 5 residents. So these soldiers would have been everywhere. And that led to considerable tension, sometimes verbal altercation, sometimes fisticuffs as well between those soldiers and residents in Boston. For 18 months, the soldiers are here, and this tension is mounting and mounting and mounting. And then it all sort of comes to a head on the night of March 5th, 1770.
And what exactly happens on that night that leads to it being known as the Boston Massacre?
Yeah, so on the east side of the old State House, facing the harbor, in the beginning of Long Wharf, there was a customs house where taxes would have been levied and paid on goods coming into Boston. And there was a sentry box in front of this custom house that on the evening of March 5th, 1770, was manned by a private by the name of Hugh White. And at some point that evening, Private White attempts to intervene in a verbal altercation between a different British officer and a wig maker's apprentice. The apprentice was harrying the officer for bilking his master on a bill for a wig that he hadn't paid. And so Private White intervenes in this, and he starts to get into an argument with the apprentice. And eventually, White's temper perhaps gets the best of him, and he smacks the young apprentice on the side of the head with the butt of his musket, perhaps hoping that that would quiet the young man. It had the opposite effect, as might not surprise folks to hear. And he starts wailing, he's screaming that the soldier is trying to kill him. And this is all within earshot of many taverns that were not very far from Long Wharf in the harbor. These taverns are filled with sailors and merchants and seamen who certainly have no love lost for the British military. And so they pile out, perhaps after having had a few ales and ciders, and they see what's going on, and they start to confront Private White. White is backed up into a corner as the crowd grows around him, to the point where somebody calls for help, for backup for Private White. And emerging from a barracks that was just on the south side of the old State House, only dozens of yards away from where White is stationed, Captain Thomas Preston emerges with about a half dozen soldiers, and they come to Preston's aid. They form this semicircular line around White and the customs house, with their bayonets fixed, trying to keep a buffer between the growing crowd and White and the customs house. The crowd continues to grow because there's some kind of scene going on, and this attracts more standers-by around the crowd. And then, for some reason, bells start ringing in town as this scene grows more chaotic. Now, bells that were not expected or previously announced could mean a number of things, but one of those things could mean that there was a fire. And fires were a very serious threat in colonial Boston. Franklin and his family would have seen and experienced at least 2 of them by this time. And so people flood out of their homes with their fire buckets, and they're looking for where to respond to, but it just adds to the chaos. It adds to the size of the crowd. Those toward the front of the crowd, who are nearest to the soldiers, are shouting epithets at them. They're goading them into firing their muskets. They're throwing ice and snow and rocks and oyster shells at the soldiers. And then, at some point, one of the soldiers is either knocked off balance or knocked down by one of these projectiles, and his musket goes off. Now, you can perhaps guess that after that musket goes off, that there's a beat, there's a moment where nobody knows what's going to happen next, because this tension is mounting. This gun goes off, and there's a beat, and then the rest of that soldier's compatriots on the line open fire into the crowd, because that's what they're trained to do. It is unclear whether or not Captain Preston ordered them to fire. Much of the testimony that is collected after suggests that Preston was desperately trying to get his men not to fire, and once they did, was commanding them to stop firing. But after that first volley, the damage had been done. 3 men are killed more or less instantly. 1 man dies the next day because of his wounds, and another man, unfortunately, suffers for a week because of his wounds and dies. And there is a 6th victim that sometimes gets mentioned, who didn't die for years later, but his family did blame the lead balls that remained lodged in his body after that night for his death years later. But traditionally, 5 victims are the ones that are associated with that night.
It sounds pretty typical of these various occasions that eventually culminate in the American Revolutionary War. Just sort of a growing tension that eventually boils over into an act of sudden and unplanned violence.
Yeah, it wasn't uncommon for soldiers to be deployed in the British Isles for crowd control and ending riots. This happened in England and Ireland, but it had not happened yet in colonial America, and certainly had not resulted in the deaths of colonists at the hands of British soldiers. It was unprecedented and an important moment in the growing revolution.
What were the repercussions of the Boston Massacre? How did news of this event spread around the colonies, and how did people feel about it? How did it contribute to the eventual revolutionary movement?
So the most immediate consequence of the shooting happened the next day in the old State House. There was a series of tense negotiations between the colonial government, the royal governor at that time being Thomas Hutchinson, and a committee that had been appointed by the town, which was led by men like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, leaders of the Sons of Liberty, who was the radical patriot faction in Boston. So there were these tense negotiations about trying to get the soldiers out of town immediately. That was the demand on the part of men like Adams and Hancock and their committee. Hutchinson didn't have the power as royal governor to order the soldiers out himself, but he eventually works with the soldiers' commanding officers to remove the soldiers as quickly as possible, which is considered a great victory for the Sons of Liberty, for the radical patriot faction of Boston. So that's the most immediate consequence, and those negotiations take place in the governor's council chamber, the same chamber that Otis argued in about 10 years earlier. More broadly than that, in terms of how word spread, that was largely the work of the Sons of Liberty and Samuel Adams as well. They immediately set to work creating a report, the short title of which was The Horrid Massacre in Boston, or a short narrative of the Horrid Massacre in Boston. So you can get a sense of this report's perspective just from its short title. It goes on from there. But Adams works diligently to collect depositions, to write a report, and to distribute that, not just through Massachusetts, but through the rest of the American colonies through various committees of correspondence that he had established. So word spreads in part because of the work of the Sons of Liberty in an effort to engender sympathy for Boston and the radical cause, to blame the soldiers, to blame Parliament, to blame standing armies and the threat of standing armies, and Governor Hutchinson for what had transpired in Boston.
And do you know at all if Benjamin Franklin, how he would have found out about this particular occasion?
So the short narrative of the Horrid Massacre in Boston, the Patriot Report, does eventually make it to England, make it to London. It actually arrives in London before the official government report that Governor Hutchinson and the British military are working on. And so I would imagine that Franklin would have eventually become aware of both reports in time. The Patriot Report was intended for public consumption. It was a piece of propaganda. And so would have probably found its way around more quickly than the government report, which was not necessarily intended for public consumption. It was an official report by a royal agent in government in the colonies to Parliament and to London. But I would imagine that Franklin would have become familiar with both eventually.
The Boston Massacre played a very important role in the build-up to the American Revolution. But when the Revolutionary War actually kicks off, when all this is going on, what's happening at the old State House? What is going on at the old State House during the American Revolution?
So at the time of the beginning of the Revolutionary War, actually not a ton, because after the Boston Tea Party in 1773, Boston is once again occupied by thousands of British troops led by, once again, General Thomas Gage, who has also made the next, and as it happened last, royal governor of Massachusetts. And he moves the government actually out of Boston up to Salem, which is another coastal town north of Boston. So the old State House itself isn't as active as it had been prior to Gage's arrival. But after the British soldiers are forced to leave Boston in March of 1776, the provincial government, which was this rebel kind of rival government that was operating in the countryside throughout the 1770s, returns to the old State House and uses it as its Capitol building again, as its center of governance in the newly independent Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And so that provincial government is working in that building from 1776 until it becomes the official state government under our 1780 Constitution. and it continues to work there through the late 1790s, which is when the state government moves to our current State House, which is located on Beacon Hill in Boston.
And after the 1790s, once that's moved to Beacon Hill, what does the old State House do in the 19th century? What happens in the building?
So the building has quite an interesting and varied history after it ceases to be the site of governance. So it effectively becomes a commercial hub in a way. It's almost like a mall in that a variety of professionals and commercial interests move into the space as renters, and they rearrange the interior, they create offices and shops, and it becomes an office building more or less for a variety of those professionals and their services and wares. And so it becomes that for about 30 or so years after the state government moves out. And then in 1830, beginning in 1830 through 1841, it serves as City Hall for Boston. Boston reclaims it for their own governance. And then after the Boston city government moves out in 1841, it once again becomes effectively an office and commercial place of business. And it is once again resegmented into a variety of different offices and shops. It is rearranged many times throughout most of the 19th century, the interior. And then as we approach the end of the 19th century, and Boston is thinking about what to do with its older colonial and revolutionary era sites, the city of Chicago, of all places, opts to or offers to purchase the building and disassemble it and reassemble it in Chicago for an upcoming World's Fair. And at this point, the people of Boston springs into action. There's a concerned group of citizens who launch a preservation campaign, which is successful. By the late 1870s, by 1881, they form an organization called the Bostonian Society, which effectively stewards the old State House and turns it into a museum, beginning from 1881, really through the present. Even though the Bostonian Society doesn't exist any longer, the old State House has served as a museum and historic site from 1881 onward.
You've talked about the old State House becoming a public space, a museum, a historic site. What happens at the old State House today? How do you tell the story to visitors who come to your site?
So the old State House is open 7 days a week, 10 to 5, and we have a variety of different interpretive products and experiences for our guests to help them understand the history of the old State House and revolutionary Boston. Part of that is our wonderful education team, our staff of floor educators and interpreters who are in our galleries answering questions and providing insight and interpretation into the old State House's history and revolutionary Boston. In addition to that, we have a number of exhibitions. The old State House is actually home to, I believe, the only exhibition in Boston that discusses Boston's revolutionary history from the 1760s through the 1780s. We also have an exhibit that discusses the Boston Tea Party through the lens of politically motivated property destruction in American history. The Tea Party was obviously one of the most famous instances of that during the Revolution, but we've had many others in American history, and we ask our guests to consider if these other instances of that property destruction change how they feel about the Tea Party, if the Tea Party changes how they feel about those other moments in history, and how they feel about violence as a political tactic more generally. And then in our recreation of the Governor's Council chamber, which has recreation chairs and tables, curtains, portraits, maps. It's a really wonderful recreation of the room that hosted so many important historical events in the Revolution. We also have an exhibit on petitioning in colonial Boston and colonial Massachusetts, because only around 15% of colonists in Massachusetts were enfranchised, could vote. And so the other 85% used petitions, among other methods, to make their voices heard. So they're wonderful exhibits. The staff that I alluded to earlier also do regularly scheduled gallery talks and walking tours that provide overviews of the history of Old State, as well as other really great stories from revolutionary Boston and beyond.
Lovely. You did mention the Boston Tea Party, which we'll be covering actually in the next episode with the Old South Meeting House. And you also mentioned as well that the Old State House and the Old South Meeting House kind of overseen or stewarded by a organization called Revolutionary Spaces. Is that correct?
Yes. So Revolutionary Spaces was founded in 2020 when the boards of the Bostonian Society, which stewarded the Old State House, and the Old South Association, which stewarded the Old South Meeting House, merged into one unified board. And that was largely the brainchild and project of our current president and CEO, Nat Shiley.
Very nice. And we've enjoyed hearing about the Old State House in today's episode, and we look forward to hearing about the Old South Meeting House in the next episode. But before we round off things with you today, Lou, one of the reasons we're doing this podcast is because in 2026, America turns 250 years old. Benjamin Franklin was central to that, and all of the sites that feature in this podcast had a role to play in the American Revolution. So I was wondering if you could tell us, what is the Old State House doing, or what do you plan on doing in 2026 to celebrate this occasion?
Yes. So the exhibit that I mentioned a moment ago about the Tea Party and property destruction, that will be closing by the end of 2025, in case anybody is interested in seeing it. But it is being replaced by a traveling exhibit on 1775 and the cusp of the American Revolutionary War and outbreak of war and the Declaration of Independence. So we'll be hosting that exhibit in the Old State House through 2026. Our petition exhibit will remain up, and our Governor's Council chamber, of course, remain open. Our overview primer exhibit on Boston and the Revolution will also remain up as well. So the traveling exhibition on the beginning of the Revolution is one of the major projects that we'll be embarking on next year at the Old State House. And then we also have some very exciting plans for our sister site, the Old South Meeting House, including an immersive theatrical experience unlike anything that exists in Boston, and to my knowledge, unlike anything that exists in any historic site in the United States.
That sounds very exciting. If I were listening today, I presume all of the information on these exhibits and the new projects will be on your website. Is that correct?
Yes, and you can find us at revolutionaryspaces.org.
And all of your social media accounts will be linked to this episode as well. So to finish, Lou, I was wondering if we could circle back to the man of the hour, which is Benjamin Franklin. Boston was his hometown. Boston was a city that he grew up in. He eventually would leave, move to Philadelphia, move to London, move to Paris. He never became a resident of Boston again, a permanent resident of Boston. But I was wondering if you could perhaps step into his boots and give us a sense of what Boston meant to Benjamin Franklin.
If I had to speculate and put my Ben Franklin glasses on, I think he might come back to two central elements of Boston during his childhood. One was, again, its connection to the sea. And I think the wider world, the wider Atlantic world that Boston was participating in, and that Franklin, as a resident, as a child and teenager, was able to experience through, again, the variety of people, of goods, of ideas that were coming in and out of Boston because of its position as a hub of British colonial North America. I think he probably benefited in terms of in education from Boston's position in that regard. And I think part and parcel to that position that Boston had was its hub as a place of literature and printing and ideas. Obviously, Franklin writes at length in his autobiography about how voracious a reader he was as a child and as a teenager. And if he hadn't grown up in Boston, he may not very well have had access to the same diversity and scope of texts and ideas that obviously formed him into the young man and statesman and thinker that he later became.
That brings our episode with the Old State House to a close today. Lou, thank you very much for coming and talking to us on finding a founder. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope you've enjoyed talking to me as well.
I absolutely have. Thank you very much, Henry. It was a pleasure.
That was Lou Rocco, the Director of Museum Operations and Experience at the Old State House in Boston. You've been listening to Finding a Founder with me, Henry Wilkinson. And next time, I'll be talking to the Old South Meeting House, where we'll discuss Franklin's heritage, his family, and his relationship with religion in the early 18th century. Until then, thank you for listening, and goodbye.